everybody! Today we're going to be learning how to cut acute angles using a sliding compound miter saw. We're going to be using some of these techniques to create a letterbox and a key holder to help to organize some of the front door clutter. If you need to skip straight to making the jig and cutting the angles, I've added timestamps to the description box and I've also added chapters to the slider bar. Of course, you're more than welcome to stay and watch the rest of the process if that's of interest to you. So if you're ready, let's get into it. It's important to use your safety gear when you're using tools, so get that first. Then we can start by planing our boards. This is especially important if you're using reclaimed wood because it can definitely be a bit rough. Here I'm using a thickness planer, but you can also use a hand planer or sander if that's what you have. Planing the wood removes a lot of the wear and the weathering, and it gives it a uniform thickness and texture. This makes sanding a lot easier later on and saves a lot of time and energy. My next step is to measure the wood before making my cuts. I chose to use some live edge pine for this piece because it's a light wood and it will match with the other wood nicely. For my project, I cut the boards to 2 feet long. I used 1 by 4 inch boards, which gave me a total width of 12 inches. I cut the letterbox to 12 inches to match the width, and shaved off a little extra to account for the live edge. I made the shelves the same length too. I find it helpful to account for the width of the saw blade when I measure, and I add a few millimeters onto the length before I cut. Now that I'm all measured, I can start making my cuts on a compound sliding miter saw. In my case, I line it up using a laser, but you can also line it up with the blade of the saw while it's safely unplugged. If you can't see the line from the laser, try dusting it off. Sometimes it gets covered in sawdust, which blocks the light. For longer boards, I extend the supports to help balance the wood while I make my cut. I also screw down the clamp to hold the wood in place. The design I'm working on today I found on a blog. I'll link it in the description below. I really like the idea, but there seems to be a few errors in the dimensions. When I was reading through the instructions, I noticed them. The idea was super creative and the result was beautiful, so I'm certainly not intending to shame the blogger. However, I will be modifying the design both in the dimensions and in certain design features that I'll be adding. All that to say, I definitely give building this a try. It's just something to keep in mind and realize it might not turn out quite the same as mine, but that's okay because you'll have a unique finished product. I've added a few cedar rounds that came from a neighbor's tree when it came down in a storm. I made sure they were completely dry and now they're ready to use. For now I'm only gluing the pieces of wood, but I've also decided to add live edge shelves to the top and the bottom of the mailbox. These will add strength to the structure, balance the design, and add space to put trinkets or sunglasses. After applying the glue, I clamp the pieces together while I wait for them to dry. Then I repeat the same steps for the backboard. Clamping the wood after applying the glue holds it in place while it dries. It prevents it from shifting and makes the bond really tight. I thought about adding dowel pegs or added support, but with the shelves acting as a crossbeam, I think it would be plenty strong enough. I'm cutting those shelves now. I chose these small pieces of live edge pine to use. And here's what the layout will look like when it's finished. There's still a lot to do, but laying out the design this way helps me to visualize the end results. While measuring out the triangular sides of the letterbox, I switched to the other side of the piece of wood because I want to incorporate the knot. Now I'm measuring a piece of scrap wood to create the jig. I use a 2x10 board, trim off the rough edge, and leave a couple of inches before starting the angle downward. The first time I saw this type of jig was on another YouTube channel, which I'll also link in the description. If you take a look at your miter saw, most of them have angles marked on the base. Loosening the handle as I do here allows the saw to be rotated freely by then lifting the lever located just underneath it. This can be done in either direction. With the board of this width, I need to loosen the screw holding the saw in a fixed position so that I can slide it forward for a longer cut. This lets it slide easily, like so. Next I trim the rough end to get a right angle. Then for simplicity, I swap the clamp to the other side. Do this by loosening another screw holding it in place. Then I tighten it back onto the opposite side, and I rotate to the 45-degree marker using the previous method. Tighten the clamp around the board, and make my angled cut. I make sure to push all the way back. Now you can remove your work. I measure the backing against the one I just cut and I mark it. I make a simple cut along the line and move on to the assembly. I gather a drill bit, screws of a corresponding size, clamps and a drill. Now we're ready to get into it. It took me 3 clamps and too long to get my setup right, but in the end it does the job. I pre-drill the holes so as to avoid splitting the wood, then I screw the 2 pieces together along the square edge. I quickly change my drill to the correct bit and drill the holes. Then I head back to my miter saw to make my angled cuts. I position the jig as close as possible to the blade without interfering with it. Then I clamp the jig to secure it. I slide my board in next to the jig and rotate the saw to the angle I need. I can carefully trace the line with my saw blade to make sure they line up properly. And if you're happy with how that looks, go ahead and make your cut. Now you're left with 2 sharp angles, but you need to trim off the extra from one piece of wood. I put the piece that needs to be cut in line with the backing and connected the piece we just removed so it can be clamped down. The triangle shape would be difficult to clamp otherwise. Then once it's secure, make your cut. And that's how I would cut this angle. Of course, there are many different ways, so it's important to do what you feel most comfortable with. Next, I'm preparing the backboard now that it's had time to dry. I start by clamping it down and sanding it with a belt sander to get the board looking a bit more polished. I try to be careful sanding around the live edge because you can easily remove it with a rough grit. I cut a lot of the sanding footage because this video is getting pretty long. I always check with my hands for rough spots, but be careful of splinters if you do this. Then I swap the clamp over so I can sand the other side too. Once I'm finished with that, I switch to the detail sander to clean up around the live edge. This tool is much more gentle and much more precise. Then I move to the table sander to finish up my wood circles. I hold them flat against the guide to clean up the surface, and I twist them against the sander to bevel the edge, but watch your fingers. Then I work on the shelves using the detail sander. I use a rough grit to remove more material and create a bit of a lip to the shelves. It's amazing what a big difference sanding can make to the appearance of the wood. Then I repeat the same process for the male slot as I did for the backing. So to recap, it's the belt sander first, then the detail sander, and then on this piece, I spent some time softening the edges as well. I thought that would be a nice touch here, since this edge faces out. Next, I align my wood circles where I want them, then dotted them with glue before putting them back in their place. This allows me to mark the wood so I know exactly where to pre-drill the holes. I select a drill bit the appropriate size for the screws. Then I move the wood circles carefully and drill in the spot of glue. Don't use too much or you'll make a mess, and also you'll gum up your drill bit. Be sure to drill all the way through the wood. This allows you to see from the back where your wood circles will be located. This will be helpful later when we're trying to attach them from the back. Next, I add a layer of glue and reposition the circles. I decided to use a piece of wood to make sure they line up because it was close at hand. Then I carefully lay the block on top of the glued circles and clamp the whole setup into place. Try not to shift anything while you're doing this. After this, I flip the whole thing over so that the back is facing me, which will let me pre-drill right into the circles using the holes we just made. Then I screw them in tightly. These are going to be very strong key storing hooks. Probably more than we need, no matter how cluttered our keychains get. After this, I'll repeat a similar process for the shelves. If you want to, you can repeat the same trick with the glue, but I just noted approximately where the center of the board sat, and I drilled there. Then I do it on the bottom too. These will ultimately be hidden and don't need to be perfect, but be careful to drill straight up and down to avoid coming out the side of the board. Cleaning up extra glue with the board you're about to glue makes sense to me. To secure these pieces, I clamp them from the sides since the front is rounded. Then I continue with pre-drilling and adding the screws. Then the exact same thing for the top shelf. I use the same scrap board to line up the sides of the letterbox. Then I glue them into place. Instead of rigging up a series of clamps here, I simply pre-drill, added the glue, then let the glue dry before screwing them in. Next, I move on to attaching the front of the letterbox, again repeating the previous steps. I held it steady with the same board and then I allowed it to dry. While I waited, I attached the hooks. I marked out the holes in the hardware using a pen. Then I removed the hooks and drilled into the marks I had made. Then I replaced the hooks and tightened the screws in using a screwdriver for more precision. Next, I bore out a shallow hole about 1/4 inch deep with a wider bit to apply the live edge dowels to cover the screws. Then I follow it up with a smaller bit and drill into the center of each of the larger holes. It wasn't fully dry, so I started by sinking one screw in before pre-drilling the rest to hold it in place. Now I'm being especially careful not to drill in an angle and come out through the side of the structure. That's annoying on a good day, but I've spent some time on this project and it's almost complete, which would have been even more frustrating. When I add the screws, I make sure to sink them deep into the wood. The bigger holes help with this and keep the wood from splitting. Next, I fill the holes with glue. Then I start inserting the live edge dowel. These are handmade from branches, so they're different sizes, so I just try to get them into the holes that fit them the best. I plan on making a short video covering how I make these, so look out for that sometime in the future. Now we're all done. Here's the finished product. I'm gonna go put it on my wall now, so I hope you found this useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Bye!